The task I've been given today is to determine whether Montreal is truly a cycling mecca, or is it resting on its laurels. I think the answer to this question is no. It's not resting on its laurels. Certainly, Montreal is an imperfect cycling city, and what the city is doing to improve it leaves a lot to be desired. Nevertheless, there have been some significant accomplishments in recent years, and I'll describe them to you today. So, first of all, just a quick outline of what I'll talk about. I'm just going to give you a little quick intro to my organization, Vélo Québec, for those of you who may not have heard of it yet. Then I'll give you a little intro to Montreal for those of you who haven't been here. Then we'll talk about some cycling statistics. We'll talk about Montreal's cycling infrastructure. I'll give you a rundown on some recent interesting developments. And we'll finish off by talking about ongoing nagging problems that we still haven't solved. So let's start first with just a quick word about who is Vélo Québec. So this organization was founded in 1967. It's now 50 years old. It's our 50th anniversary this year. We're a nonprofit. We're actually a group of 4 companies now. One of which is called the association which I work for, which is kind of the original founding company. And since then, we've also founded a company that runs cycling events here in Montreal and across Quebec. We have a bicycle travel agency, which organizes guided bicycle tours around the world. And we also have a publishing house, which puts out a few cycling magazines, as well as a science magazine. Overall, the mission of the whole Vélo Québec group is to encourage cycling, and be it for transportation, for recreation, or for tourism. What you see on the right of the screen is that's from our bicycle festival in June called the Go Vélo Festival. This shot was taken from oops, sorry, my screen has popped out of presentation mode. Okay, so this photograph was taken at an event called Le Tour la Nuit, which is a Friday night evening bike ride, which typically brings in about 15,000 people. And then the following Sunday, we have a big event called the Tour de l'Île, which in its heyday would bring in over 30,000 people, and it still easily attracts about 20,000 cyclists. So now the department that I work for, which is called the association, what we do is we do research and consulting. We also run Quebec's bikeway, provincial bikeway system, which is called La Route Verte, which we helped plan, and now we manage it on behalf of the provincial government. It's a 5,300-kilometer cycling network, 40% of which is off-road, and the rest of which is on provincial highways and also quiet back roads. We have a very large walk and bike to school program. Most recently, we've gotten into cycling education, so we're developing a cycling certificate for elementary school children right now. And we've also started a bicycle-friendly municipality as well as bicycle-friendly organization program, which is similar to that which has been created by the League of American Cyclists. So we give municipalities, organizations, gold, silver, bronze certifications depending on their efforts for promoting cycling. So now about Montreal. Montreal is in the eastern part of Canada, although for some reason we call this central Canada here, but it's directly north of New York City. We're about 500-600 kilometers directly north of New York City. We're also close to the capital, Ottawa, which is 200 kilometers to the west. Montreal is an island. It's actually part of an archipelago that's in the Ottawa and St. Lawrence River Delta. The city of Montreal occupies a large portion of this island. All of the statistics that I will be providing and the bicycle network that I'll be describing is actually that of not of the city of Montreal, but rather the island, because it's all planned as a whole, and the city of Montreal actually plans and implements cycling facilities on behalf of the other cities on the island. So Montreal's current population, 2016 population, is 2 million people on the island, about 1.8 million in the city proper. And the metropolitan area now has reached 4.1 million people. Our climate, we have what's known as a humid continental climate. What this means specifically is that we have very hot and humid summers. Temperatures above 30 centigrade are not uncommon in July. Being continental, which means far from the ocean, we have fairly long snowy winters. The snow cover here in Montreal typically starts somewhere between late November and mid-December, though in recent years this has been definitely a lot less predictable, most likely due to climate change. And we typically have snow until late March, early April. And in January, which is our coldest month, the average temperature is almost minus 10 centigrade. That's average. That's not the low temperatures, which can easily drop below minus 20. So now to talk about some cycling statistics, Vélo Québec has been doing for 20 years now a study of rates of cycling in Quebec every 5 years. Our most recent one was in 2015, published just last year, but the data is for the year 2015. So in 2015, cycling rates in Montreal there were about 1 million people, based on a survey that we did, about 1 million Montrealers rode a bicycle at some point in 2015. That's equivalent to about 51% of the overall population. It also means that 53% of adults between 18 and 74 were on a bicycle at some point in 2015, and 78% of children aged 3 to 17. In terms of gender distribution, of those who reported cycling, 54% were men and 46% were women. And that's generally, if I go back here actually, that's generally probably a good sign. In North America, males tend to be overrepresented among cyclists. And according to some cycling researchers, having a good gender distribution close to parity is usually indicative of having a fairly good bicycle culture, and probably indicates having a relatively decent cycling environment in which people other than reckless 18 and 20-year-old men feel comfortable cycling in. Now, as for cycling for transportation, about 536,000 Montrealers reported cycling for transportation at least occasionally. So that means at least once a week throughout the summer season. So that means from May 1st until the end of September. Based on our regional transportation survey, so we have our regional transportation planning agency does a very big survey every 5 years. It's a very detailed household travel survey. 76,000 households are surveyed, so it's a very rich data set. And we know from this, the most recent edition, which was in 2013, that there were about 116,000 trips made a day by bicycle. And that was a 57% increase relative to the previous survey, which was in 2008. And even more interestingly, the rate of cycling jumped at downtown Montreal, especially. So there was an 80% increase noted. Cycling mode share. So this is a mode share. This is a 24-hour all trips, all purposes mode share. This is not cycling to work. This is cycling for all purposes. This is also based on the household travel survey that I mentioned. Overall, for the whole island, we have a cycling rate of cycling mode share of 2.5%. In the central neighborhoods, which is equivalent to roughly, that's about 1 million people, so it's about half the population. The mode share for the May to September period is about 4%. The Plateau Mount Royal district, which is, if any of you have been to Montreal, it's one of the most bicycle-friendly neighborhoods. The mode share there has reached almost 11% of all trips being made by bicycle. And the Plateau has well over 100,000 residents. And then there's also what's known as the Villeray district, which for those of you who know Montreal, it's not quite the same as the Villeray borough. The Villeray district includes the boroughs of Villeray, Saint-Michel Park Extension, as well as Rosemont Petit Patrie. Also fairly dense boroughs in the center of the island, 6.4% load share. Here what you see is a visualization of GPS data that was collected by an app that the city created called Mon Réseau Vélo. It's an app the city created to try to understand where people are cycling. As of course, they're not just cycling on the bike network, they're using streets throughout the city. And this is GPS data from actual cyclists. And what you can see, the dark area, those are the central neighborhoods. That's downtown, the Plateau, and that Villeray district that I mentioned. The white spot near the dark area, that's actually Mount Royal, which is a big park. And Mount Royal is also it's the mountain in the middle of the city after which the city takes its name. Now, the seasonality of cycling, of course, Montreal has a cold winter, as I mentioned, and cycling rates do decline when it gets colder, and they decline significantly. Here you have a pretty representative profile. This is from a counter at the corner of de Maisonneuve Boulevard and Peel Street in downtown Montreal. It's the counter that reads the most cyclists of all the about 20 counters in the city. It can reach up to 10,000 cyclists a day on a warm summer day. And what you see is that, as I said earlier, the high season is from early May to September. October is generally still pretty busy too. And then November, December, cycling declines. And January, February are generally the least busy months. And then in March, unless we have a giant snowstorm like we did this week, usually it starts picking up again. Now, what we're talking about more and more now in Montreal is the winter cycling retention rate. So it means how many of the people who ride in the summer keep riding through the winter. based on counter data and also based on our 2015 survey, the answer is about 10 to 15% of summertime cyclists do cycle at some point during the winter. That doesn't mean that on the coldest day in January, there's 10%. What it means is that during the winter period, 10 to 15% of those who cycle during the summer do cycle at some point. And that number is increasing according to most data that we have. Lastly, for the statistics, cycling safety. So here you have a table showing figures for fatalities, serious injuries, and light injuries for the 6 years ending in 2015. Generally, what you can see from these figures is that the rates are fairly stable. There's actually seems to be a decline, at least in fatalities. Last year there was only one in 2016. And in the previous years, which you can't see before 2010, there were more than 5 or 6 a year. So what this is indicative of, if you consider this in the context of growing bicycle use, that bicycle use has increased almost 60% in a 5-year period, this actually means that the injury rates per bicycle trip or per kilometer are dropping. And that's, by the way, most likely, it seems that corresponds very well with data from other cities which talk about a safety in numbers effect. So the more cyclists you have, the safer, the relative safety of cycling increases. So let's talk about infrastructure. So our network is evolving. Here's a picture. This is an old picture from before the car era. That's from the 1890s. It's a bicycle map of Montreal. And as some people have pointed out, actually bicycles or cyclists were among the first to lobby governments to pave roads before the car was invented. And here you have a map which was actually made by a tire company, which shows you roads on the island and off the island of Montreal that were bicycle friendly in the late 19th century. More recently, cycling started really coming back here in the 1970s. So of course, like every other place in North America, Montreal had a serious flirtation with, serious love affair with the automobile. I mean, arguably it still does. But in the 70s, there were activists who started demanding that the city give some space to cyclists. And one of these the most famous activist group in Montreal was called Le Monde à Bicyclette. And they staged these group rides in the 70s, and they also staged these really neat theatrical protests, such as the one you see here, where they wore these frames that were roughly the size of a car, just to make the point how much less space cyclists take, and that they wanted some space too. What that led to is that in the 70s, the city started developing its first off-street paths, mainly along riverbanks and along canals. However, the pressure from the cycling advocates was steady, and in 1984, grudgingly, the city started developing some on-street bike paths, or cycle tracks, I should say. So these are separated bike facilities. Nobody had ever seen a bike lane here, a painted bike lane in Montreal. So instead, apparently some city engineers here went to the Netherlands to see how they do it, and they saw these separated to a bike path. So that's what they did here. But initially, these were just recreational. They were essentially just to link up several of Montreal's large parks. Nobody ever conceived of these as a utilitarian transportation network. At least not until 2005, that's when the city really just started widely recognizing that the bicycle is a mode of transportation and that there were these surges of use in the morning and the evening, before and after work hours. And the city government at the time initiated a fairly rapid expansion of the network. In 2007, the city of Montreal built its first cycle track through downtown, which this was a dream of that those cycling activists in the 70s had. That was one of their dreams. They had asked for that already back then, and finally in the 2000s it was implemented. And in fact, the cycle track is named after Claire Morissette, who was one of the most prominent cycling activists, who unfortunately passed away before the cycle track on de Maisonneuve Boulevard was built. But it's named in her honor. In 2008, the city came up with a new transportation plan, and in that plan, it, for the first time, had introduced the idea of a winter cycling network. So that's when that was launched. And the next year, the city also launched our Bixi system, which is our bike share system here in Montreal, which I'll talk about later. So this is Montreal's cycling network as of the end of 2016. 788 kilometers is the official tally. I'll tell you a little bit more about the makeup of this network. We now also officially have a 430 kilometer so-called four-season network. So that means 430 of those 788 kilometers are open. At least they're not necessarily maintained, but they are in theory open for use in the winter. So this is the breakdown. This particular chart comes from our 2015 study, so it's slightly out of date. A little bit more has been added in 2016, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what the distribution is. So in 2015, there were roughly 750 kilometers, and 180 kilometers of which were shared streets. So these are generally quiet streets with sharrow markings and increasingly also with traffic calming devices. There were 214 kilometers of paint-only bicycle lanes, 82 kilometers of cycle tracks. So that means those are separated or protected on-street bike lanes. And lastly, 271 kilometers of off-street paths, of which some are exclusive to bicycle and some are shared with pedestrians. And then I'm just going to show you a bunch of images of these different types of facilities, just to give you a flavor of what it's like and what the environment here is like. So this is a fairly typical off-street path. And in Montreal, they're often separated. So there's, as you can see here, there's 2 lanes for cyclists and 1 for pedestrians. This is what these look like in winter. Unfortunately, many of these are not maintained, or at least not maintained for cycling, because some of these become, for instance, cross-country ski paths. So they're not accessible to cyclists in the winter period. Although they are technically still open, so if there's no snow cover, you can use them, but the city doesn't maintain them. One of the challenges here is that because they're in parkland and natural areas, there's a reticence to use salt to de-ice. So it's unclear how these would be maintained in the future for cycling. So shared lanes. One thing about shared lanes in Montreal is that you do not see them on major arterials as you would in some other North American cities. They are generally kept on fairly low traffic streets. In fact, provincial standards in Quebec indicate that shared lanes should not be made on, you should not designate streets that have more than 3,000 cars a day for shared lanes. Which is, in my view, still actually quite high, but at least it's not an arterial sort of level of traffic. Here's what these look like in winter. So the problem with these in the winter is that when there's a lot of snow, as there is right now, the usable width is reduced, and the cohabitation with vehicles becomes a little trickier. And on a narrower street like this, cars can't really overtake cyclists. Luckily, people are becoming more and more kind, and cyclists and don't rush them too much. And also, the speed limits have generally been dropping down to 30. So cohabitation is less stressful than it used to be, but not ideal. Bicycle lanes. So you've all seen these before. These are just painted bicycle lanes. We have a lot of bicycle lanes in Montreal that run on counterflow on one-way streets, such as the one as you see here. This is the exact same street, same place in the winter. So these, as you can see, are also challenging in the winter because when there's a lot of snow, the snow tends to encroach into the bike lanes. And when there's, in the presence of parked cars, such as here, it's very difficult to keep that snow out because every time a car enters or exits this parking space, it's going to push the snow back into the bike lane. And as you can see, the markings here are obscured by the snow. So someone unfamiliar with the street might not even realize that there are bike lanes, particularly the one running counterflow. Things are a bit better when there's no parked cars, because then when a plow goes through, it takes the snow out of the bike lane and it stays out. So as you can see here. And then finally, we have those 82 kilometers of cycle tracks. So this is one of the more recent ones on Park Avenue. By the way, this location that you're seeing, this used to be sort of a multi-level highway-style interchange, which was an absolute death trap for pedestrians and cyclists. So the city converted it to knock down the cloverleaf interchange structure and replaced it with an at-grade intersection and this nice wide cycle track going through it. Rachel Street. This one was built also in the late 1980s. This is Rue Boyer. This is part of the main north-south. It's called the north-south axis. This was also built in the 80s. And this cycle track was built simply by moving the parked cars away from the curb and putting in delineator posts. And like most cycle tracks in Montreal, it's bidirectional on one side of the street. This is what these look like in the winter. Now you should keep in mind that the one you're looking at here on Rachel, this is, as I said, built in the late 80s. Nobody ever dreamt that this would be used in the winter, but it is now being used. It's being plowed, and it's actually used quite heavily. This one has been registering easily up to 1,000 rides a day over the last few weeks, despite snow and cold. This is the one on the Rue Boyer. Same thing. It's was never conceived to be used in the winter, but the city has figured out how to do it. And in fact, it's the first time this year that it's open. But we'll talk about that a little more later. Some of these old 1980 cycle tracks, however, are still they're closed for the winter. So they typically close November 15th and reopen April 1st. And what happens is that the bollards or delineators, those green posts along the cycle track, are removed and cars park in the cycle track. And great confusion ensues because people are used to riding them two ways, and they're often on one-way streets. So you have these situations such as what we see on this picture where cyclists are not on the right side of the street and biking against traffic, and so not an ideal situation, but hopefully one which will change soon. This is again from our 2015 cycling study. So we wanted to put our bike network into perspective and compare it to that of other large Canadian cities. So we did have one of the largest networks in 2015, and I'm pretty sure that's still true, except for Calgary, which has an incredible number of pathways along rivers and in parks, which beef up its total network length. One area where we do really excel is that we have a lot more of this on-street separated infrastructure, so 82 kilometers as of in 2015. A few more kilometers were added last year in 2016. So we're way ahead of the curve there. However, it is worth noting that both, well, actually all three of Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary have definitely not been slacking in that department and have added quite a few kilometers in all three cases over the last couple of years. This is the current plan for the bicycle network, which was put out in 2014. The plan is to reach 1,280 kilometers by the middle of the next decade. So that means adding about 500 kilometers to the current network. And the target is to add about 50 kilometers a year. Some of the details on this network are still not clear. We don't really know what kinds of facilities the city intends to put. Based on where the lines are indicated, we can see that many of them will likely be shared and bike lane facilities, but there are also some that appear on arterial roads, so we're hoping that that means that more separated facilities are coming. As for budget, the city over the last several years has been putting about $10 million up for cycling every year. That increased recently to 12.5, and for the current year, it's about $15 million. And that budget covers the upkeep of the current network. So not things like sweeping, but it means repairs, so surface repairs, redoing the markings, replacing broken bollards, upgrades, which means actually widening or improving, physically improving existing bikeways, and then expansion, which means adding actually new kilometers. So aside from bike lanes, of course, we have some other infrastructure elements being developed. One thing the city's been doing is putting in more bike boxes, or also known as advanced stop lines, particularly at very busy intersections where there are a lot of bicycle turning movements. This one is right at the front gate of McGill University. And what you can't see just off the screen is there's a cycle track on the cross street. So a lot of cyclists are turning to our right, which is the direction towards the downtown core. The city has been doing a lot of traffic calming on local streets. This is one of my favorite traffic calming measures done over the last couple of years. This is a diverter at the corner of Chambord and Guilford Streets. There's a second one block further. So this one forces cars to turn. Cars can't go through the intersection, but two openings have been made so that align with the bike lanes so that cyclists can go straight through. So that's what we call selective permeability. And there are other traffic calming features that also do take cyclists into consideration. For example, if there's a bike lane or a cycle track, and if the city puts in a speed bump, the speed bump will usually not extend into the bike lane. It'll only apply to the car lane. So as I mentioned earlier, we have over 20 counters, and the city's adding more. Here we can see there's a cycling totem, which means it's a counter with a display, with a public display. This is on Laurier Avenue East. And then last but not least, of course, I have to mention Bixi, which is our bike share system, which the city of Montreal actually developed the hardware itself. It was unsatisfied with what was available on the market back then in 2008-9. So it developed its own hardware and sold it to other cities, such as New York City and London and Chicago, among others. We have, back then there were 3,000 bicycles right from the start, 3,000 bicycles and 300 stations. The system has grown over time. This year, it'll be reopening on April 15th because it shuts down for the winter. So April 15th, there'll be 6,200 bicycles and 5,400 stations. And do note that that's almost as many bikes as New York City, and I think it's more than Chicago, and which is, considering that Montreal is quite a bit smaller than both of those cities. Usage statistics: 4.1 million trips last year, even though the system is open only 7 months a year. An average of 19,000 trips a day. Peak days, 31,000 trips. So 19,000 trips a day. Last year there were about 5,000 bicycles on the street, so that means each bike got used by about 4 people on average per day. So some recent interesting developments that I wanted to highlight. Here you have Rachel Street, which actually our office is located on. A couple of years ago, this old just paint and delineator parking separated cycle track on Rachel got a major upgrade. It had problems because it's a two-way cycle track on a two-way street, so there were some conflicts at intersections, partly due to parked cars masking cyclists in the cycle track. So the city got rid of all the parked cars on the side of the street with the cycle track, replaced it with planted medians, which added much needed greening to the street, and resolved some of the conflicts by doing so. Still not an ideal infrastructure, but it's definitely better than before, and much wider and easier to use. Another great development that happened last year is this very old, venerable cycle track on Boyer Street, which was just unbelievably congested and bottlenecking always at rush hours. Got a green wave treatment, which means that the traffic lights on this cycle track are now synchronized to the average speed of a cyclist, about 20 kilometers an hour. And the direction depends on the time of day. So when people are inbound towards downtown, they synchronize in the inbound direction in the morning and in the outbound direction in the evening. Another thing that's coming soon is these Copenhagen-style raised cycle tracks on about a 3-kilometer section of Rosemont Boulevard. So finally, Montreal is going to build unidirectional or one-way separated lanes on a major arterial street. So we're really looking forward to seeing this project implemented this summer. Montreal has also signed up to Vision Zero, which now exposes the city council of being accused of having zero vision. But they do intend to do some things. So one announcement already has been that the local residential streets will all be changing to 30-kilometer-an-hour speed limits. There will be more traffic calming. The city intends to do a lot of pedestrian and cycling improvements at intersections. And also, Montreal is a city crisscrossed by railways, and the city has promised to secure these railway underpasses for cyclists, either by converting car lanes to bike lanes, as we see on the left, or where sidewalks are reasonably wide, they allow cyclists to use the sidewalk through the underpass in these cases. Montreal has definitely improved greatly in managing construction projects. So if there's a bicycle facility running through a construction area, the promoter is now obligated to provide a safe, protected detour through the construction zone. And as you can see here, I showed some people this picture and they said, wow, your temporary infrastructure is better than our permanent infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not always this good, but this was a particularly good example on Barry Street. But there are still some frustrating cases where people, where the contractors are blocking, they park their cars or they block the cycleway. So, but it's getting better. The other thing is that these winter closures that I talked about, they are starting to end. So a big one this year was that this north-south, old north-south cycle track is now being kept open largely. And it was recently announced that that the city intends to have 100% of the network open within a year or two. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that they meant it. So this cycle track, this happens to be right in front of my house. So for the first time this year, it's being kept open. And not only is it being kept open, but it's being treated as an arterial cycle track. So as you see here, it's being cleared of snow before the street, because this is just a local street, but it's an arterial cycle track. So higher priority for maintenance. The other new thing this year is we have new equipment for maintaining the bikeways in the winter. So some of the boroughs have been experimenting with new techniques. The most promising technique is the one on the right, using a snow sweeper and liquid melter brine instead of granular salt. And this produces really very good quality surface for cyclists. As you can see on the right, you get basically with this method, essentially you have just bare asphalt. Regular snowplow tends to leave a layer of snow, which then the city has to dump a pile of salt on to melt away. Whereas the sweeper just sweeps it all off and just needs to spray a little bit of this brine so that if new snow falls, it doesn't stick to the surface. So we're hoping that this technique will start being used citywide. It's only being used on about a 3-kilometer section of cycle track this year. Another thing worth mentioning is that the city is also moving to integrate our bike share system more strongly with public transit. So people will be able to use their public transit smart cards to unlock bike share bikes and take single rides for $2 for a discounted rate. This is another development too, is that our police, they've been using bicycles in the winter for a while, but this winter we've noticed that they have whole units now that are on winter bicycles. Whenever there are public events, outdoor events, or protests, they send out this winter cycling unit to patrol, and they were out just the other day. This was taken 2 days ago. So, I mean, not everything is hunky-dory in Montreal. I mean, there is still definitely room for improvement. We do have a lot of infrastructure of questionable quality, such as what you see here. Just this painted bike lane with, tour bus parking and basically on the 2-lane highway next to it, not great. So we think at Vélo Québec that the city needs to invest more into separated bike lanes. So some of these conventional bike lanes need to be separated. They need to be converted to separated cycle tracks, particularly on higher volume roads. We need cycle tracks on commercial streets. The city still likes to put a bike lane on a street parallel to the main street and sort of doesn't seem to realize that the destinations are all on the main street, which is where the bicycle infrastructure should be as well. And the other thing too that the city is failing to do is it's doing a lot of reconstructions right now, rebuilding sewer infrastructure. So the whole streets are being dug up and they're being put back without cycling infrastructure. So when you dig everything up, this is a great time to introduce the kind of infrastructure we see on the picture here. Churchill Avenue North in Ottawa, this was a recently reconstructed street. Ottawa used the opportunity to build this raised cycle track, which is otherwise a cost-prohibitive thing to do. We could also use some better treatments at intersections, such as these 2-stage turn boxes, which are totally unknown yet as of yet in Montreal. Very common in other cities in Canada and North America. And the other thing that no one has ever seen here before is a protected intersection. So this is an intersection where such as they do in the Netherlands, where the pedestrian and bicycle crossing is set back from the intersection, so that a car, has time. There's a delay between when a car turns and when it crosses the bike lane. There isn't really yet a notion of designing for all ages and abilities, as there is in Vancouver, for example. So I think that many of our bicycle facilities don't really pass muster for what we would call 8 to 80 design, where an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old would feel comfortable. Another thing too is, since we intend to keep the network open all winter, we really need to start designing things better to work in the winter. So this is, I showed you earlier, this is a cycling facility that was never designed with the winter in mind. This is what happens in the winter. There's a big windrow forms and encroaches into the facility. I mean, it's still usable, but it's not ideal. It would be better if there were a space here that was intended for storing the snow so that it didn't have to go into the bike lane. This is something I've already mentioned, so complete arterial streets. So this is another case where the city has demolished, where you see the park here. This is a park that the city will build soon. There used to be an elevated freeway there, which the city demolished, which is great, bravo. Getting rid of these vestiges of the 1950s. However, on this huge 100-meter wide right-of-way, it never occurred to anyone that perhaps it would be a good idea to put in a separated bike lane. So we think it's a bit unfortunate that they couldn't spare about maybe 3 or 4 meters for some cycle tracks in this 100-meter right-of-way. The city recently announced that you can see there are reserved bus lanes. The city is building a new train system, which will open hopefully in 4 or 5 years, and they claim that at that time they'll be able to convert those bus lanes to cycle tracks. So we still think it's unfortunate that they didn't think of cyclists from the start. So Grumpy Cat is not impressed. The other thing that's really sorely missing is a minimum grid of protected facilities throughout the downtown core. We just have that one red line through the middle. It really doesn't give access to all the destinations downtown. It's one of the most destination-rich parts of the city, also one of the most employment-rich parts of the city. So we need a grid of separated facilities that will let more people safely and comfortably get to their destinations and their jobs downtown. Parking in the city center is also an absolute disaster. There's a desperate lack of bicycle parking facilities on street. Apparently there are a lot of underground facilities for people who work downtown, but if you're just coming for a casual shopping trip, you can sometimes look for quite a while before you find some vertical object to which you can attach your bicycle, and not legally. Another issue is that Montreal, as I mentioned, is on an island, and a lot of people who work here or do activities here on the island don't live here. They live across the river, and these people are unfortunately unable, as of yet, to cross the river in the winter because the bicycle paths on the bridges are closed. So the bridge we see here, which is called the Jacques Cartier Bridge, the federal agency that runs it is promising to try to open it next winter. They're going to heat parts of the bridge and sweep snow off of it. So we're looking forward to that pilot project. And especially people who live on the South Shore and who want to cycle downtown are looking forward to it. The integration of bicycles and public transit could be a bit stronger. Montreal only has bicycle racks on 8 of its well over 100 bus lines, whereas some of the suburban municipalities now have them on 100% of their buses. Also, we could use a few more secure bicycle parking stations, such as the one you see on this image at Lionel-Groulx Metro Station, at Metro and commuter stations, so that people can securely leave their bicycles. You're not allowed in Montreal to bring your bicycle on commuter trains and subways at rush hours. which is fine. I mean, that's actually the case in many places in the world, but at least people should be able to make the journey from their home to the nearest station on bicycle and leave their bicycle in a secure parking facility and have peace of mind. Now, the other thing too is we think the city should set some serious targets for cycling. The only target that it has is to add 50 kilometers of infrastructure per year, which is not a great target, because what ends up happening is they just go for the low-lying fruit and add 50 kilometers of what's the cheapest and easiest to do. And they don't, instead, it would be better if there were a qualitative measure, so where they did things that would benefit cyclists more. So it would be useful to have a mode share target. We don't have one. So what kind of cycling mode share would the City of Montreal like to achieve? And it could also maybe establish other performance indicators, such as what kind of gender and age distribution would it like to see among cyclists, what kind of winter retention rate it would like to see, and what kind of rates of decline in injuries and fatalities it would like to see as well. So that's it. If you do have some, if you're looking for a little bit more information of some of the background, the studies that I mentioned, the data sources that I mentioned, they're at these web addresses. And also at the bottom you have the city's cycling page, where you can find more information. It's in French, unfortunately, for those of you who don't read French. But you can also see maps of the cycling network, and also the city's information on its plans for the future. So thank you. That's all I have for you today. And so I'll hand it over to Darren for the questions now.